When people talk about the conflict between religious believers and those who don't share their faith, one of the biggest frustrations is the sheer difficulty of persuasion. Religious individuals often believe that if they just explain their views clearly enough, or present the right scripture, or share the right personal story, anyone outside of faith will suddenly see what they see. They think it's simply a matter of communication. But the reality is much deeper. The very frameworks by which people make sense of the world are so different that conversion almost never works in the way believers expect. One major reason is the clash of evidence standards. A person committed to religion often relies on scripture, tradition, or personal experience as their foundation. To them, these sources feel completely reliable. They don't necessarily need external validation because their trust in authority has already been cemented. But for someone who evaluates claims through reason, science, and testable evidence, those sources don't hold the same weight. Telling someone that a holy text says so doesn't land if that text itself isn't recognized as authoritative. It's like citing a novel to prove a historical fact, persuasive only if you already assume the novel is more than a story. When one side's foundation isn't accepted by the other, arguments don't transfer. Then there's the issue of personal experience. Religious people often describe powerful feelings of transcendence, moments of prayer that felt answered, or a sense of being guided. To them, these are undeniable proofs. But the human mind is prone to illusions, biases, and emotional states that feel profound but have natural explanations. A brain can release chemicals that create euphoria or awe. Coincidences happen that line up with prayers. None of that requires supernatural intervention. For someone who sees those patterns through the lens of psychology or probability, the personal testimony doesn't convince. It only demonstrates how easily we can mistake inner experience for external truth. The failure also stems from how people form their identities. Belief isn't just a matter of ideas. It's tied to culture, community, and self-image. Religious people are often raised in environments where faith is normalized and celebrated, but those outside that structure have already built meaning in different ways, through human relationships, knowledge, creativity, and moral reflection. When someone already has a functioning framework for purpose and ethics, appeals to a divine authority don't feel necessary. It's like trying to sell insurance to someone who's already fully covered. There's nothing missing for a religious explanation to fill. Another reason conversion stalls is that religion often relies on fear. Promises of eternal reward or threats of punishment are powerful within a religious mindset, but outside of it they lose traction. If someone doesn't believe in heaven or hell to begin with, the motivational pull collapses. It would be like warning someone that if they don't follow certain rules, Santa Claus won't bring them gifts. The threat only works if the premise is already accepted. Without belief in the premise, the emotional blackmail doesn't work. It's also important to recognize the different ways people handle doubt. Within religious circles, questioning can be framed as weakness or even rebellion. So when believers approach someone who openly questions everything, they often interpret it as stubbornness. But in reality, a questioning mindset is simply a different default setting. It's not about rejecting faith out of pride. It's about expecting claims to meet the same standards as any other knowledge. If a medical treatment or a scientific theory demands evidence, why wouldn't the biggest claims about existence and eternity face the same demand? To many outside of religion, granting faith a free pass feels unjustified. Sociology also plays a role here. Religious institutions thrive on group identity. They foster belonging through rituals, shared language, and moral boundaries. For someone outside of that world, the collective pull isn't the same. A sense of belonging can come from countless other sources: friendships, professional communities, hobbies, activism, even online spaces. When someone already experiences deep connection outside of religion, they don't feel the same gap that religious groups assume everyone must have. Attempts to lure someone with community often fall flat because the need has already been met elsewhere. Another obstacle is the way religious arguments often move goalposts. For example, a believer might present a philosophical argument for a creator. If that doesn't work, they pivot to morality, claiming that without faith there's no foundation for ethics. If that's addressed, they shift to personal testimony or prophecies or miracles. This shifting approach makes it clear that the arguments aren't really built on evidence, but on the determination to defend belief no matter what. For someone outside of religion, it becomes less of a conversation and more of a maze, and it's hard to feel convinced when the target keeps moving. History adds another layer. Believers often argue from the longevity of their tradition, as if survival itself proves truth. But human history is filled with thousands of religions, each of which seemed true to its followers, many of which lasted for centuries before fading away. If survival is proof, then every long-lived religion would be equally valid, which leads to contradiction. This undermines the idea that any single tradition holds exclusive truth. For someone who sees the big picture of history, the claim that one particular set of myths and rituals outshines all the rest feels unconvincing. Cognitive science also explains why conversion rarely works in one direction. Believers often assume that humans are naturally wired to reject doubt unless persuaded otherwise. But the evidence suggests humans are wired to detect agency and meaning everywhere, even when it's not there. This tendency made sense for survival. It's better to mistake the wind in the bushes for a predator than to ignore an actual threat. Religion taps into this overactive sense of agency. Once you recognize that tendency, you see gods as products of the brain, not external realities. And once someone understands that mechanism, appeals to faith lose their bite. There's also the issue of exclusivity. Most religions claim a unique path to truth or salvation, but when every faith makes the same claim, it highlights the arbitrariness of believing one over another. A Christian telling someone that only Jesus saves is not different in structure from a Muslim saying only Allah guides, or a Hindu pointing to Krishna. If all of them can't be right at once, why assume that one's own tradition has the monopoly on reality? For someone who has already stepped back to see the broader picture, each claim cancels out the others. Conversion attempts don't convince. They just demonstrate the diversity of human imagination. In many cases, religious people assume that non-believers live in despair, searching for something greater. They frame faith as a cure for emptiness. But when someone has already found joy, meaning, and morality without it, that diagnosis doesn't fit. It's like offering medicine to someone who isn't sick. The pitch misses its target because it starts from a mistaken assumption. It's worth noting that attempts at conversion often rely on repetition. Preachers are trained to keep sowing the message, assuming that constant exposure will eventually break resistance. But for someone who's already examined those arguments and found them lacking, repetition doesn't increase credibility. It highlights weakness. If the truth of a claim depended on how many times you heard it, advertising jingles would be unshakable truths. Instead, constant repetition tends to dull persuasion rather than sharpen it. Another overlooked factor is the role of honesty. When a believer shares their faith, they may think they're being open and vulnerable, but to someone on the outside, it can come across as manipulative, especially if the believer frames friendship or kindness as conditional on conversion. It turns what could have been genuine connection into a sales pitch. People sense when their humanity is valued only as a potential recruit. That transactional dynamic shuts down openness rather than creating it. Even when religious people present philosophical arguments, such as the cosmological argument or the fine-tuning argument, they often assume those lead naturally to their specific deity. But even if one entertained the idea of some ultimate cause, it doesn't automatically follow that this cause cares about human behavior, demands worship, or resembles the gods described in ancient texts. The leap from abstract cause to personal deity is enormous, and for someone accustomed to logical reasoning, the leap is too wide to accept. What also blocks conversion is the realization that morality doesn't need divine command. Many people live ethical, compassionate lives grounded in empathy, social contracts, and shared human values. Studies consistently show that societies with higher levels of secularism often have lower rates of violence and higher measures of well-being. This challenges the narrative that faith is necessary for morality. When real-world data shows that people can flourish without religion, the argument that only divine authority can produce good behavior collapses. Another dimension is power. Religion has historically been used to justify authority. Kings ruling by divine right, laws rooted in sacred texts, leaders claiming to speak for God. But when you see that pattern, you start to notice how faith often serves the interests of those in power, rather than some universal truth. Once someone recognizes the political role of religion, it's hard to see conversion attempts as anything other than the continuation of that same dynamic. Authority cloaked in spirituality loses its charm when its history is laid bare. There's also the emotional weight of recognizing harm. For centuries, religion has been tied to wars, persecution, oppression of women, suppression of science, and discrimination against minorities. While individual believers may focus on the kindness or charity within their traditions, the broader track record complicates the claim that religion is purely good. For someone aware of this history, being asked to join a faith can feel like being asked to join an institution with baggage too heavy to overlook. The psychological need for certainty is another driver. Many people are uncomfortable with ambiguity, so religion offers clear answers about life's biggest questions. But for someone who has learned to live with uncertainty, that offer doesn't entice. Not knowing the ultimate purpose of the universe isn't frightening, it's honest. The promise of certainty starts to look like wishful thinking rather than truth. Conversion fails because the comfort of false answers is less appealing than the honesty of open questions. All of these reasons add up to a simple but profound reality. Persuasion fails when the foundations don't align. Religious people assume that their arguments are universal, but they only resonate within their own framework. Outside of that framework, the words land on different soil. And once someone has built a worldview based on evidence, reason, history, and human experience, that soil is not fertile for religious claims. This doesn't mean conversations between believers and non-believers are pointless. They can still foster understanding, compassion, and even friendship. But when the goal is conversion, the effort almost always falters. The assumptions don't translate, the threats don't apply, and the emotional appeals don't land. It's not stubbornness or pride that blocks the process. It's the simple fact that once you've stepped outside of faith, the door swings one way. It's nearly impossible to unsee the mechanisms that create belief, and once those mechanisms are visible, arguments from faith lose their power.